Thank you for inviting me to come to speak here in Tullamore, returning to Tullamore to speak. This slide shows reenactors at the Battle of the Boyne Centre, developed by the government outside Drogheda in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. For 3 years, from 1689 to 1691, Ireland was the scene of a major war. On one side was a largely Irish Catholic army, the Jacobite army, which was mostly newly raised and backed by the power of France. The term Jacobite comes from Jacobus, the Latin version of King James II's name. Ranged against it was a multinational force that included English, Ulster-Irish, Dutch, Danes, Germans, and Huguenots, French Protestants. Mostly they were Protestants, these soldiers, although there were some Catholics in the continental contingents. These formed the Williamite army, named after William of Orange, newly installed as King of England and James's antagonist in Ireland. The war in 1689 was for Ulster in the north, with the Jacobite army eventually driven back by William's Protestant supporters there, although the Jacobites prevented a large Williamite army from penetrating further south. In 1690, the war was for Leinster in the east, with William coming in person to defeat James at the Battle of the Boyne, a victory that enabled the Williamites to seize the capital, Dublin, and also to overrun East Munster in the south. But the Jacobite army regrouped behind the Shannon, the great river, very roughly, marked with a blue line that runs like a backbone down the centre of Ireland. The western province of Connaught and County Clare now became the citadel of Jacobite Ireland, and the army successfully held Limerick and Athlone, the major bridging points against Williamite attacks in the autumn and winter of 1690. In 1691, the battle was for Connaught. The Jacobites rather carelessly lost Athlone at the outset, allowing the Williamite army to cross the mid-Shannon. The decisive battle of the war followed at Aughrim in County Galway. The Jacobite army came close to winning it, but the death of their French general, Saint-Roux, undermined command. The cavalry abandoned the infantry, who were left to be slaughtered in thousands. Resistance continued in Limerick, but with food running out, the army was forced to make terms, and in the autumn, and this ended the war. The war goes by several names: the Jacobite War, the Williamite War, the War of the Kings. But whatever the title, it's the only occasion that Ireland has been a significant theatre of a major European war. It was a major crisis in Irish history, releasing shockwaves that have yet to subside. The forces involved were immense. In 1690, 63,000 troops were present at the Battle of the Boyne. This is a near contemporary illustration of it. It's probably the largest concentration of soldiers ever seen on a battlefield in these North Atlantic islands. 40,000 were engaged at Aughrim in 1691. By comparison, at Marston Moor, numerically the largest battle of the English Civil War, fought in 1644, 42,000 men were present. At Culloden, the famous Scottish battle, fought in 1746, less than 20,000. In terms of casualties, I can only cite the Reverend George Story, a fair-minded Williamite army chaplain who wrote the best contemporary account of the war. He said, "There have died in that kingdom of one sort and another at least 100,000, young and old, besides treble the number that are ruined or undone." He calculated the death of combatants at 26,230, very precise, which was something over a quarter of the total casualties. So, there was nothing bloodless about the Irish phase of the so-called Glorious Revolution, in which William overthrew James's regime in England. They call it the Glorious Revolution because it was pretty bloodless in England, but it certainly wasn't here. Neither was it bloodless in Scotland. A number of factors, frequently misunderstood, converged to bring about the conflict. First, the dynastic quarrel. King James was a Catholic convert. His heir was his daughter Mary, who was married to his Dutch nephew, William of Orange. That's William and Mary on the left, and King James in military uniform on the right. William was the stadtholder or protector of most of the provinces that made up the wealthy Dutch Republic. But William and Mary's expectations of inheriting the English throne appeared to be dashed by the birth of a son to James in 1688. To salvage the situation, William invaded England with the support of an influential faction there who did not want a Catholic succession. James's religion and his political ineptitude had undermined his position in England. His opponents had subverted the English army, and it offered scarcely any resistance to the Dutch invasion. James and his family fled to France, and William and Mary became joint sovereigns of England. But James had his adherents. Their support for his attempt to recover his thrones was the most obvious cause of the war, but not the only one. King Louis XIV of France, pictured here on the right, ruled the most powerful state in Europe. On the left, he is seen welcoming James on his arrival. Everyone knew a European war was coming, which would be France versus the rest. William was Louis's inveterate enemy and a key player in the alliance forming in Europe against France. Louis had expected England, a growing power, to be at least neutral in the coming war, while James was king. William's prime motive in seizing England was to add her resources to the alliance and thus tip the scales in its favour. For this very reason, the Glorious Revolution was a considerable setback for King Louis. To counter it, he welcomed James to France, and he decided, and that's happening there on the left, the two kings embracing, and he decided to destabilise William's new regime by sending James to Ireland with the promise of generous military support. The idea was to use Ireland as a springboard from which James could re-establish himself in Britain. Privately, the French didn't think much of James's chances, but they calculated that William would be forced to turn his attention to Ireland to deal with the threat James presented there, and this would distract his attention and his resources from Flanders, where William would otherwise take the offensive against France. Ireland became involved because the Irish Catholics were prepared to support King James, their fellow Catholic, in the expectation that they would recover the wealth and influence they had lost to new British settlers in the wars, confiscations, plantations, and religious discrimination of the preceding century. By 1688, the Catholic share of land ownership, the main form of wealth in Ireland then, had dropped to only 22%. And you can get the idea here. The green is the Irish part, the most Irish part in County Galway, and then the light green is lesser Irish, and the brown is scarcely any Irish landowners at all, including in County Offaly, but it's not quite true of the light green areas, but it's largely true. The Irish Jacobites forced a reversal of the post-Cromwellian land settlement on a reluctant James when he arrived as the price of their military support. Ireland had a population of about 2 million people. It's estimated that 3/4 of them were Catholics of either Gaelic or Anglo-Norman ancestry. Old enemies, but now more or less united in the face of common adversity. Their leader was the Irish Catholic Richard Talbot, pictured on the right. He was an old friend of James, who had ennobled him as Earl and later Duke of Tyrconnell, given him command of the Irish army, and then placed him in charge of the Irish government. This was all before James's fall. Tyrconnell fostered a Catholic resurgence. Catholics received public appointments. And in a few years, he transformed the Irish army from being an exclusively Protestant force into a largely Catholic one, with an establishment of 8,500 officers and men. However, in 1688, almost half its strength was lost in England in a vain effort to prop up James's ailing regime. Well, James arrived in Ireland in March 1689, and the Irish were soon disillusioned with him. After the Boyne defeat, when he left Ireland, they took greater control of their own affairs, and a split developed between the more nationalist professional army officers led by Patrick Sarsfield on the one hand, and on the other Tyrconnell, who was very much seen as King James's man and regarded by the professional soldiers as militarily incompetent to boot. The other quarter of the population in Ireland were new or newish Protestant settlers, comprising English Anglicans and Scottish Presbyterians. The latter, the so-called Ulster Scots, were and remain firmly entrenched in Northern Ireland. Alarmed by the threat of a Catholic resurgence, Irish Protestants generally supported William, and the Ulster Protestants provided no less than 6 regiments to the Williamite army. On the right, the slide shows Orangemen, named after William of Orange, marching through Belfast, as they do annually to commemorate the Williamite victory at the Battle of the Boyne. Their narrative stresses Williamite successes, Derry, Aughrim, Enniskillen and the Boyne, as the banner on the left shows. But in fact, the Jacobites had their successes too. Dromore, Dundalk, Athlone, Limerick, Ballyneety, and Sarsfield's defence of the Shannon in late 1690. But above all, it was an immense achievement of the Irish army to sustain a war for 3 full years against a better equipped and more professional international army commanded by generals of European reputation. Contemporaries remarked on how much the Irish hated the English. They were ennemis irréconciliables, according to the French. And in particular, there was no love lost between the Ulster Scots and their Gaelic Irish neighbours. Plus ça change. I've lost something here. Yes. No. Irish Jacobites could not have sustained their war effort without substantial French support. Over 3 years, this came aboard 8 fleets that carried more than a score of generals to lead the army, civilian officials to organise it, and 250 French regimental officers to furnish military expertise, together with artillerists, engineers, gunsmiths and other artisans, and substantial supplies of arms and materiel, that's to say military supplies. Only one fleet was intercepted by the English Navy in a 4-hour battle at Bantry Bay off West Cork in May 1689. It involved over 40 warships. None were sunk, but the French had the best of the engagement, which remains the largest naval battle ever fought in Irish waters. For once, the French Navy was the strongest. But while it maintained communications between France and the south and west of Ireland, it failed to exploit its superiority by disrupting Williamite logistics and communications in either the Irish Sea or the English Channel. In 1690, 2 brigades of French infantry, 6,000 men, were sent to Ireland for the campaign. But Louvois, the great French war minister, who disapproved of the Irish adventure, insisted that their number be made up in France by the transfer there of an equivalent number of Irish soldiers. Curious way to send help. On arrival, the Irish were formed into 3 regiments of infantry, which were then incorporated into the French army to lay the foundation of the famous Irish Brigade. This picture depicts the Clare Regiment going into action at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. Note, they wear the distinctive red uniforms of the Irish Jacobite army, and on their colours, their flag, they maintain its mottos and devices. Today is not the time to tell the story of the French and Spanish 18th century Irish brigades, the wild geese as they're called. But it's worth reminding ourselves that they were the direct descendants of the Irish Jacobite army, and they formed a respected military force that was long associated with the exiled Stuarts and their attempt to recover their lost crowns, and where possible, and whose possible return was the cause of much Protestant anxiety in Ireland in the first half of the 18th century. And here's something I bet you didn't know. One unit in the modern French army traces its origins back through the wild geese to the Irish Foot Guards, the senior regiment in the Irish Jacobite army, which dates from 1662 and which went to France in 1692. And it's the 92nd Infantry Regiment based at Clermont-Ferrand, which provides the mechanised infantry component of the French Army's 2nd Armoured Brigade. On the left, you can see them in their combat role, and on the right, parading with the 18th century colours of the regiment, the Cross of St. George and the Stuart crown on a white background. So they're using in that the colours of the regiment in the 18th century. The other overseas operation by the Irish Army was to send 300 to 400 strong infantry regiment, newly raised in Ireland, to support Viscount Dundee's Scottish Jacobites in 1689. French frigates, making a rare appearance in the Irish Sea, carried the expedition from Carrickfergus to Scotland in time to reinforce Dundee before his victory at the Battle of Killiecrankie in July. The Irish were posted in the Highland Army's centre, and they won praise for their bravery from Dundee on his deathbed. He was mortally wounded in the battle. Their charge was likened to a stampede of wild cattle. But the Scottish Jacobite resistance was crushed after Dundee's death, but some of the Irish remained on the Isle of Mull until as late as 1692. In the centre is John Drummond, 1st Earl of Melford, an influential Scot who accompanied James to Ireland. To Tyrconnell's fury, James tactlessly made Melford Secretary of State for Ireland. He was highly unpopular with both the French and the Irish. Accused of incompetence and even treachery in the wake of the army's Ulster defeats in 1689, he withdrew to France less than 6 months after coming to Ireland. 4 Scots also held generals' appointments in Ireland. They included Major General Thomas Maxwell, pictured on the right, who was on duty in Athlone at the time of the final assault in 1691. In Ireland, at the end of 1688, on learning that James had been deposed, Tyrconnell immediately set about an enormous expansion of his depleted army. There was no shortage of men offering themselves as officers and recruits. Estimates vary, but within months, more than 50,000 were engaged. However, this force proved too large and it had to be cut back. Numbers varied, but in round terms it's probably safe to think of an effective force of about 30,000 men, of which 20,000 formed the field army, and 10,000, more poorly armed, were in garrison. The number of units varied, but they work out at an average of about 45 regiments of infantry, almost all of one battalion of 13 companies, and about 17 regiments of cavalry and dragoons. Dragoons are mounted infantry. That's to say they rode round on ponies, and when it came to combat, they dismounted. They were mobile infantry, I suppose. The two soldiers on the right are illustrating muskets, which were the main firearms of the period. Much the most common was the matchlock, which is the weapon held by the soldier in the foreground, while the soldier in the rear is holding a firelock or flintlock. The difference was in the ignition system. The charge in the breech was ignited by a flaming match in the matchlock, and the musketeer is blowing on his match there to get a bit of, flame out of it before he attaches it to the little cock, and then he pulls the hammer. It goes down and ignites some powder in a pan, and this hole in the barrel, the flash goes through and ignites the charge inside and discharges the musket ball. Whereas a spark generated by flint striking steel was the hallmark of the flintlock. Once you fired, the effective range of both was about the same. That's to say, about 100 metres. After that, the musket ball lost velocity, and it was increasingly like the same as being hit by a stone. Wouldn't do you any great harm. An army of 30,000 required an establishment of about 2,500 officers. And I estimate that over 3 years, at least 4,000 officers served in all. For the 1690 campaign, the army was supplemented by the 6 French infantry battalions, 2 brigades. The army also had a small field artillery train, largely French, together with engineers, artisans and commerceries, also mostly French. The field army would have been accompanied by 10,000 horses or more and large numbers of cattle. The logistical challenge was immense. Soldiers and livestock had to be fed, and the soldiers were also accompanied by their wives and children, who also had to be fed and accommodated. To give you an idea, when the Irish army arrived in France after the war, the French officials were nonplussed by the numbers of their accompanying dependents. Boridal, the commissaire at Brest, complained of the number of women and children, girls and servants there are in officers' families. He wrote, consisted of 10 or 12 people, and ordinary soldiers come with their wives and 4 or 5 children. So quite a logistical challenge to feed that lot. The Irish army had enormous problems to overcome. The lack of weapons and materiel for the expanded force was largely met by France. Over 3 years, Louis sent a 12-gun artillery train, 25,000 muskets, carbines and pistols. Carbines are short muskets used by horsemen. 27,000 sabres and swords, 12,000 pikeheads, 27,000 grenades, and large quantities of such items as powder, match, belts, spontoons, bandoliers, sickles, panniers and saddles. And in 1691, 20,000 uniform coats, food, brandy and wine. It sounds a lot, but it was spread over 3 years, and in real terms, it met the army's needs for just about 1. Horses, uniforms, food, and some weapons and materiel were also sourced locally. An officer's commission was potentially a valuable commodity. In return for theirs in the expanded army, The new officers were expected to subsist their units at their own expense for the first 6 months. This was more than most of them could afford to do, and the consequence was widespread crime and disorder as the soldiers seized whatever was to hand, especially from the remaining Protestant landowners. The solution was to pay the soldiers, but lacking either the money or the fiscal resources to do this, the Jacobite government hit on the idea of minting as pay base metal tokens of copper and brass, the so-called gun money, which traders were required to accept. This picture shows one of the tokens minted in Dublin. It displays an image of King James and his claim to be King of England, Scotland, and, rather tactlessly, France. The reverse side also tells us that the coin was minted on the 30th of September 1689. This is because the redemption of the coins for cash was intended to be chronological. Gun money enjoys a bad press, but the evidence is that it worked quite well until the Jacobite defeat at the Boyne undermined its credibility. By the end of the war, it was valueless. And of course, the Jacobite defeat meant that the tokens were never redeemed. However, all good things come to those who wait. Today, 300 years later, you'd pay perhaps €200 for a gun money shilling in good condition. An infantry captain is pictured on the left, and he's holding a lead staff. It's like a short pike, which was the symbol of authority of the officers, the commissioned officers. And on the right is an original, picture of an original officers' commission of 1689. Catholics in Britain and Ireland had been kept out of military life for a generation. Most of the officers and all the private soldiers of the Irish Jacobite army lacked military experience or skills. To some extent, the deficit was made up by Irishmen who had soldiered abroad, by British Catholic officers who followed James to Ireland, and by the regimental officers sent from France. In all, these experienced officers numbered about 400, or 10% of the total. Most of the rest had never seen military service. The French officers and infantry battalions were withdrawn after the Boyne. Tyrconnell chose the regimental colonels, who were mainly wealthy Jacobite supporters, including 27 peers, Lord Upper Ossory and Lord Clanmalier amongst them. They in turn nominated the junior officers. Well, in fact, those peers were too poor to form a regiment, but they were officers. They in turn nominated the junior officers, the colonels did. As the war progressed, more professional soldiers were promoted to positions of command. And all, of course, nominally held their commissions from King James. The rank and file were volunteers, drawn from the farming, artisan and labouring classes. Most were from rural backgrounds, as Irish towns, apart from Dublin, were very small. The officers drew on the residue of seigneurial influence, and the Catholic clergy naturally were enthusiastic Jacobites and influential supporters of recruitment. The priests also contributed to the maintenance of army morale. But there was undoubtedly great popular enthusiasm for the cause. The censorious English Jacobite, John Stevens, who served in the army as a junior officer, expressed his admiration for the ordinary soldiers' fortitude and their propensity to the end to endure hardship, starvation, and worthless pay without complaint. The French who came to Ireland had a low opinion of the army officers, but they admired the physique and military disposition of their men, whom they considered would make excellent soldiers if trained and properly led. On the left is Patrick Sarsfield, film star good looks, the most famous and successful Irish soldier of the war, ennobled by James as Earl of Lucan. He is an experienced officer who had previously served in France and England. Sarsfield led the Irish army to France after the war, where it remained King James's army, as distinct from the regiments that went out in 1690. But he was killed 2 years later at the Battle of Neerwinden in 1693. We'll come back to him. On the right is Portumna Castle, home of the Earl of Clanrickard, who raised an infantry regiment, as did both his brothers, Lords Buffon and Galway. Typically, none of the three had ever seen military service before the war. Well, that's not quite true. Lord Galway had served briefly in the Irish army before the war, but he was relatively inexperienced. At all levels, the Jacobite army was very much a family affair. For example, Sarsfield was the brother-in-law of the three Clanrickard Burke brothers of Portumna. After his death, Sarsfield's widow, Honora Burke, pictured on the left, married the Duke of Berwick, pictured on the centre. He was King James's illegitimate son and a future Marshal of France. But he served in Ireland as a 20-year-old Lieutenant General, and that's undoubtedly where he first met Honora. Honora's sister, Margaret, also married successively two Jacobite colonels. First, Lord Ivey, and after Ivey's death, Colonel Thomas Butler. He's pictured there top right. The Butler's home at Kilcash is shown bottom right. It's a typical late medieval tower with the remains of a 17th century house built onto the side, a very standard residence of many Jacobite officers. And Sarsfield's own sister was married to yet another Jacobite colonel, Lord Kilmallock. The McCaughlan's of Garrycastle in West Offaly provide an instance of this interweave of family relationships in the army at a more local level. On the right, that's Kilcolgan Castle. I see its picture in the hall as well here, so you know it well. One of the great houses of the McCaughlan's, sadly demolished in the 20th century. One of their other big house was Kincora, of which, as far as I know, nothing remains and no image exists. But if someone can do better than that, I'd like to hear it. John McCaughlin of Kilcolgan was a captain in Lord Galway's foot, and Cornelius McCaughlin of Kilnagarna was his lieutenant. Terence McCaughlin of Kilcolgan was a captain in Clifford's Dragoons. Robert Cusack, his brother-in-law, was his lieutenant. John McCaughlin of Kincor was a captain in Oxburgh's foot, as was his cousin, Edmund Mooney of Doon. Francis Mooney was Edmund's lieutenant, and Edmund McCaughlin was his ensign, the third officer of his company. In all, 9 McCaughlin army officers are listed. As well, the McCaughlins were related to the Malones and McGagans of Westmeath and to the Bellews of Duleek, all strongly represented in the army. Lady Oxburgh, née McCaughlin, described as a stiff, bigoted papist, was married to Colonel Sir Heward Oxburgh, and their sons were all army officers. The archetypal Offaly regiment was the one raised and commanded by Colonel Oxburgh. He had been the Parsons' agent in Birr, but he now took the Jacobite side. By 1691, he had been succeeded as colonel by his son Henry, whose picture is there on the right. The regiment's original lieutenant colonel was a veteran soldier, Sir Edward Scott, one of these experts that they were able to bring in from outside. But by 1691, he had been succeeded as lieutenant colonel by Henry's younger brother, Heward Jr. The majors both had local names. They succeeded each other, successively Matthew Mooney and Lawrence Delhunty. The regiment, like most, was a single battalion of 13 companies, each company commanded by a captain, lieutenant and ensign. Its establishment was therefore 43 officers and 650 other ranks. In autumn 1689, it mustered only 350 other ranks, but by 1691, it was almost 600 strong. Altogether, we can name 75 officers who served with it at some stage during the war. And they included, as well as 3 Oxburghs, 5 Malloys, 4 O'Connors, 4 Delahunties, 4 McCaughlan's, 4 Carrolls, 4 Callanans, 3 Moonies, 3 Dailies, 2 Egans, 2 Deegans, 2 Maddens, 2 Dowlings, 2 Donnells, 1 Dunn, 1 Pay, 1 Parlin, 1 Keenan, and 1 Flattery. All from Offaly, or in a few cases from nearby baronies in the adjoining counties of North Tipperary and East Galway. There were also Offaly officers in other regiments, but not very many. At a quick glance, I've traced only 10. There might be some more, but about not many. Colonel Dick Grace from Moyelly, 2 McCaughlan's, 2 Wolverstons, Francis Seagrave, Anthony Malloy, Hubert Fox, and Patrick Kennedy. The Irish Jacobite army was not a rabble, but a properly organised, if inexperienced, military force. It began badly in 1689, but it had improved by 1690, and in 1691 it fought well, despite being heavily defeated. On the battlefield, in accordance with the convention of the time, it deployed in 2 lines, with the infantry battalions in checkerboard formation in the centre, protected by the cavalry and dragoons on the right. And if you look at the upper part of the slide here, in the middle, you can see the 2 lines of the this is a contemporary engraving of the Battle of Aughrim. You can see the 2 lines of the infantry battalions, and you can see the checkerboard formation that I'm talking about on each line. The battalions formed up facing forwards at this stage. And so there's a gap between each battalion, and then that gap is filled by the battalion immediately behind in the checkerboard arrangement. And then you've got the second line with the same idea. Of course, you put your best soldiers in the front line. We still use the expression front line. It comes from this. In the middle picture, the infantry battalion is drawn up for battle. The musketeers provided the infantry firepower, while the pikemen, with their long pikes, who were between 1/3 and 1/4 of the infantry personnel, they protected the regiment from cavalry attack in the absence of bayonets. So if the enemy cavalry looked as though they were going to attack the musketeers, the pikemen stepped forward, held their pikes at an angle of about 30 degrees from the ground, and said, "Come on, make my day," to the cavalrymen, because they couldn't. The horses simply would not go through that. They would shy. Infantry engagements were generally decided by firepower. That's to say, the armies moved to within about 60 yards of each other, and then the infantry blazed away. And the guy with the most firepower held his ground, and the guy with less firepower didn't. So that's how it worked. And because of that, the Irish infantry did badly at the Battle of the Boyne, but much better at Aughrim a year later, when they had more firepower and they were better at it. By deploying in 5 or 6 ranks and using the French system of firing by rank, a fairly continuous fire could be maintained. So 6 ranks deep, the raid across the thing, and the front rank fire their muskets, kneel down. The second rank and start to reload. The second rank fire their muskets and kneel down and start to reload. The third rank, likewise, until you get to the final 5th or 6th rank, they fire their muskets, they kneel down, start to reload, and then the front rank stand up, having reloaded, and discharge theirs, and so it goes. Oh, if only it went as smoothly as that on the day, you know. But that's the principle. Hand-to-hand fighting by the infantry was the exception, although it did occur. Bagpipes were widely used by the infantry, who also had a fondness for shouting and hallooing before an engagement. On the left is a dragoon, mounted infantry, deployed for skirmishing on the flanks and in the front of the army. They dismounted for their skirmishing, but they could move away quickly on their ponies. On the right is a cavalryman, and they'd have been on both sides of the infantry line. The main task of the cavalry was to protect the infantry flanks from the enemy cavalry, and if possible, to turn the tables and drive back the enemy cavalry and so threaten the opposing infantry. Battles were often decided by cavalry breakthroughs on the wings. This was what happened at both the Boyne and Aughrim, precipitating the Jacobite defeats. But it must be emphasised that the Williamites feared and respected the Irish cavalry, especially after their very courageous performance at the Battle of the Boyne. The Oxburgh brothers all fought at the decisive and bloody Battle of Aughrim. One, probably John, who was a cavalry officer, has left a valuable account of the battle, which has only recently come to light. I won't quote it all, but of his family's involvement, he wrote, "The battle was like to finish my family. For my brother Richard, that was a major to the Lord Kilmallock's regiment, that was once Lord Lucan's, and Hewer, that was lieutenant colonel to my brother Harry, were killed on the spot, with Harry shot in 3 places, of which he lieth with some hopes of recovery. And myself had 2 horses killed under, and in the retreat rid through 2 squadrons of the enemy without being examined." He means without being noticed that he was their opponent, so he's saying I had a close shave. Well, Colonel Harry, or Henry, did survive, only to come to a sticky end. In 1715, he took a leadership role in the Jacobite rising in England, for which he was hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn. Sarsfield was the dominant personality in Jacobite Ireland during the winter of 1690-91, when the army was confined to Connaught and Clare, its citadel. It was challenging for the region to support both it and the accompanying camp followers. As a cavalryman, Sarsfield was particularly anxious to extend the army's quarters as far out as possible into the no man's land between the armies. It's because the cavalry horses needed the fodder. In Offaly, this was west of the line of Williamite quarters, which were at Ferban, Dangan, Killay, Ballyboy, Eglish, Burr, Ballymooney and Leap. At Banagher, pictured left, a fort guarding the bridge across the Shannon. A fort guarded the bridge across the Shannon. And the town was an important bridging point, which a substantial Jacobite force used in late September 1690 to cross into Offaly to attack Burr Castle, pictured on the right. This is what it looked like at the time, which was relieved before it could be taken. The Jacobite governor of Banagher throughout the war was Colonel Garrett Moore of nearby Cloughan Castle, whose wife was a Clanrickard Burke from Portumna. But even if the attack on Burr failed, elsewhere the Jacobites occupied or pushed into parts of West Offaly, North Tipperary, Southwest Meath and the western parts of other counties to the north and south, and they still held Kerry and West Cork. There were frequent small-scale clashes in no man's land throughout the winter. The Jacobite army was supported by 3 auxiliary forces. 2 of them were not particularly effective, a county militia, and, secondly, an auxiliary Gaelic army, 13,000 strong, led by an ex-Spanish officer named Baljarg O'Donnell, which operated in North Connaught. Baljarg's forces were organised into 14 infantry regiments, of which one was commanded by Conor O'Connor. He appears to have been from Offaly, and if so, his regiment was probably recruited from this region. We could say a lot more about Baljarg's force, we haven't time now. The third auxiliary force, bands of partisans called rapparees, often directed by army personnel, was far more effective. It harassed the Williamite army very successfully, killing stragglers, interfering with communications, and pillaging supplies, destroying quarters, and rustling horses. The rapparees were especially active along the frontier and in the Williamite quarters. Frequently mentioned as places of rapparee activity or countermeasures against them, either at or in their vicinity, are Mount Mellick, Burr, Ferban, the Bog of Allen, Mount Rath, and Port Tarlington. I've gone a little outside Offaly, but you get the idea. Rapparee activity generated the customary atrocities of partisan warfare, which were exhibited by both sides. Captured rapparees, for example, were usually hanged without ceremony, and their severed heads and other body parts put on public display pour discourager les autres. On the left is the fine 19th century bronze statue of Patrick Sarsfield in Limerick. The Articles, or Treaty of Limerick, ended the war. The people on the right are demonstrating bottles of treaty beer outside the Treaty City Brewery in Limerick. And the whole war is a big part of Limerick's sort of folk memory. The terms of surrender seemed generous. They allowed those who wished of the Irish army to go to France. Led by Sarsfield, about 16,000 took this option. So 20,000 Irish soldiers went to France during or at the end of the war. And there they formed a nominally independent army for King James until 1697, when the army was demobilised. And this was in addition, as I said, to the 3 regiments sent in 1690, which were already incorporated into the French army. Alternatively, those still in arms or under the army's protection could opt to receive a pardon, go home, and retain their properties, provided they swore an oath of allegiance to William and Mary. Many landowners in particular, of the remaining landowners in particular, took advantage of this. In general, it can be said that the terms were more or less honoured in the letter, but certainly not in the spirit. Catholics were supposed to retain the religious privileges they had enjoyed under Charles II, which proved a valueless guarantee, and they were soon subjected to draconian anti-Catholic laws. They lost further ground to the new Protestant ascendancy, and they were in no position to give support to either the Jacobite risings in Scotland in 1715 or in 1745, although the continental Irish were involved in both, and Henry Oxburgh, as we saw, lost his life in the former. The 18th century Gaelic poetry suggests that Jacobitism remained a popular cause amongst the ordinary Irish people back in Ireland. Beyond that, King James, of course, was not restored, and King William consolidated his position in the 3 kingdoms, albeit at a considerable cost. But the King of France was definitely a winner. For a comparatively modest investment, the Irish diversion had successfully disrupted William's continental plans for 3 years and protected France and Flanders. Furthermore, in the process, Louis's military strength was augmented by the bonus of over 20,000 battle-hardened Irish soldiers. Sarsfield was the most famous Irish soldier of the war, the darling of the army, according to one Jacobite officer. On the continent, Marshal Luxembourg, the greatest French general of the period, told King Louis XIV that he had particularly noticed the valour and fearlessness of which Sarsfield had given proof in Ireland. He is a very good and a very able officer. And he's currently in the news. Thanks to the splendid efforts of Dr. Luc Goyen, pictured here on the left, of Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, It looks as though Sarsfield's body has been discovered at Huy in Belgium. And if DNA testing proves it to be so, then we can probably expect a state funeral for the general in Limerick. And, well, he deserves it. In Athlone, Victoria Barracks was renamed Custom Barracks in 1922 by General Sean McGowan to commemorate one of the heroes of the Siege of Athlone in 1691. We also have Custom Place. Grace Road and Grace Park Road are named after the defender of Athlone in 1690. Sarsfield Square is named after Sarsfield, and St. Ruth's Park after the French general killed at Aughrim. And we used to have a nightclub called Ginkles, named after the Williamite general that took Athlone. But should I be glad or sad it's closed? Finally, may I briefly mention our book my father and I produced, The Irish Jacobite Army, published last summer. It covers in detail and more systematically the topics I've touched on today. You can see the story of the war is briefly told, and then the peacetime army, the reaction to the revolution, the infantry, cavalry, artillery, French involvement, command and staff, discipline, training and tactics, support services, finance and logistics, backgrounds and beliefs, auxiliary forces, the fate of the army, and there's a conclusion then that sort of shows the continuity of the tradition through Irish history. And I'm hard at work on a companion volume, which will be an alphabetical list of the regiments. There are about 100 of them altogether, because they came and went. And we give a short portrait of each regiment with location of its recruiting area, for example, Oxburgh's in Offaly, numerical strengths, record of service, ultimate fate, and where known, uniform and colours, flags, details. Lists of officers of each regiment, with footnoted, where possible, short biographies of each and their portraits. Now, there's 4,500 officers covered. I estimate that we'll have footnotes of somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000, maybe closer to the 2,000. So it's a mighty task. We're supposed to finish it by the end of this year, and we may. So that's the plan for the second volume. And there are quite a few portraits that I've been able to trace of the colonels of the different regiments, maybe 20 or so far. And so that's their pictures will appear in the second book as well, which is Four Courts are going to publish. So that's it. Thank you all very much for your kind attention.